and he's the host of All About You podcast and Pat's Psychology Masters YouTube channel. And his talk is titled Decisions Inside and Outside of the Real World. Welcome, Pat.
I can sit up here and look at the wall. I didn't realise there's so many people behind me. Can everyone hear me okay? Right, great. So, as Evan introduced me today, I'm going to be talking about decisions inside and outside of the real world. Outside of the real world being inside the O'Connell lab, where I do my day job at Trinity College Dublin. So, I want to begin by talking about decisions being conducted inside the real world. So, it mightn't be obvious at first, but our daily lives actually consist of innumerable decisions all the time. Like, for instance, at the moment, I'm moving my hands, I'm implicitly deciding not to punch myself in the face by accident. I'm walking around the room, I'm consciously putting my steps somewhere that I'm not going to trip and embarrass myself. I'm projecting my voice at a particular volume to try and make sure all you guys hear me. So, implicitly, decisions are just made all of the time. And decisions can be broken down into two-choice or multiple-choice decisions. To give an example of a two-choice decision, I want to bring you through a decision process that I'm actually going on at the moment, and it's of pretty sincere consequence. I'm trying to think of what I want to have for dinner. So, am I going to have a pizza or a burger, right? So I'm reflecting, I'm thinking, right, well, for lunch, it's pretty small, very carby, wasn't that much protein. So that would be evidence in favour of a burger. But then again, I absolutely love cheese, so maybe I want a pizza. But then again, the last time I got a pizza, I was fairly hungry after. It didn't fill me. So, no, listen, I'm going to get a burger, big side of chips, that'll sort me out perfectly. I've gathered enough evidence to reach the threshold to make my burger decision. So, outside of the real world then, we look at random dot motion tasks in the lab. So, much like Steph had alluded to earlier, we try and squeeze these bigger decisions down into something much more simple. So, an example of a stimulus that we use in the O'Connell lab are these random dot motion tasks. So, a two-choice task will be one like on the left. So the dots are going to move either left or right. So it might be hard for you guys to see at the back, but there was kind of a period of noise there, noisy motion, and then there's some coherent motion. And if you've gotten the trial correct, you'll have detected rightward motion. Okay? So in that case, I've asked my participant, where do you think it moves? Hit left for left, hit right for right. We also have a continuous outcome version of this task, where the coherent dots can be moving in every direction on a particular trial. It could be moving in any particular direction. So here, the red line corresponds to the actual direction of motion. Okay? So you can see the dots can be moving up or down or top left or to the right or wherever. Okay? And we might give a participant a joystick and ask them to do a movement in the direction that they perceive. Or we might track their eyes, as we do in my research. So, in the O'Connell lab, we mainly use electroencephalography, or EEG, which is the skull cap with the electrodes here, and the electrodes are put into the electrode holes, and there's some gel put in to pick up the electrical signals being propagated from the cortex of the brain, that outer layer of the brain. And my supervisor, Redmond O'Connell, he's famous for discovering the CPP in humans, or the central parietal positivity. What the CPP is really cool for, what Redmond discovered about the CPP was that it tracks evidence accumulation, okay? So as a person is looking at something like a random dot motion task, like I displayed on the previous slide, they're collecting evidence, and then ultimately they reach a threshold, just like I reached when I made my burger decision. So, without getting into the nitty-gritty of this little animation here, we see some evidence being displayed on the top, and we see the decision trace, which is just like the CPP, kind of mapping on to that evidence and ultimately reaching a threshold, which is that black line on the top. I can elaborate on this in the Q&A if you wish, but we'll leave that for now. So in terms of factors that impact our decision making in the real world, well, we can be biased and we can be under speed pressure. So in terms of the pizza versus burger decision I was talking about earlier, let's take, for instance, if I'm Mark Wahlberg, I'm having a burger all the live long day, right? I have a chain of burger restaurants. I have a huge incentive to be seen to be eating burgers. I can't be seen to be eating pizzas and sending customers across the other side of the street to a pizza restaurant. I want people to be seeing me eating burgers, so that's my huge bias there. However, I might also be under speed pressure. And one thing I neglected to mention earlier is when I made that decision earlier about pizza versus burger, my brother is in the audience and he hates when I make slow decisions. He's like, just pick, will you? So that was one of the reasons. Burger, that'll do. And so I might end up disappointed with my burger. And this image was generated using OpenAI. I asked it to spit out Usain Bolt looking sad eating a burger. So there you go, filled up that bit of white space. Inside the lab, we can also look at bias and speed pressure as well, okay? I might design a stimulus such that a participant might be more biased to pick, a certain direction over another direction. I might do that by telling my participant, okay, you're being displayed with a random dot motion task and you need to tell me if the dots are going to move left or if they're going to move right. If you select left and are correct, you'll get 30 points. If you select rightward and you are correct, you'll get 10 points. So I've just biased my participant to select for leftward motion, okay? They're going to get more points if they're correct in the left direction versus correct in the right direction, in the rightward direction. I might also put them under speed pressure and tell them, you need to make this decision within 2 seconds. Some people in the audience will have participated in my research and they'll have seen this dreaded too slow message. So if they respond beyond that deadline, they'll be getting that warning, which will put them under a bit of pressure. And our participants are incentivized to score as much points as they can because their payment at the end typically maps onto how much points they score. My research specifically looks at misperception, okay? So, interestingly, in these continuous outcome dot motion experiments, where the dot motion can be in any particular direction, there's a pattern of responding which is very surprising that has emerged from the literature. What we see is much more often than chance, participants will respond in the direction opposite to what was displayed, okay? This isn't nearly as much as the rate of correct responding, but it's definitely much more than a random error. So I'm looking specifically at these opposite direction reports to see what's going on, okay? And one of the things I've found is that people make these decisions with a level of confidence that is greater than a random error response, but not as great as a correct response. So, while I'm on the topic of confidence, that's also something that we can look at in a perceptual decision-making lab, to see how confident people are in their decision. And we can have, much like the perceptual task itself, there can be two-choice or there can be continuous outcome. So for a two-choice task, we might ask participant, how sure are you in your decision? Are you pretty sure or are you not sure? And that could be done by clicking the left or the right button on a mouse. In my research, we look at a continuous outcome scale. So that ranges from I'm super, super confident that I got the right answer to I'm super, super confident I didn't get the answer, and everywhere in between. So we get a finer grained insight into how confident the participant was. So I guess the take-home message from my presentation is the low-level perceptual decisions that we use in our lab give us an idea of how decisions are made in the real world, okay? Using electroencephalography, or EEG, we're able to get a better insight into how the brain is actually making these decisions. And we can use these EEG signatures, like the CPP, to develop computational models of how the brain is actually working. We're also using fairly magnificent resonance imagery, I hope I got that answer right, to try and detect exactly where the activity is occurring. So the CPP, central parietal positivity, we think it's happening in a central parietal location. But EEG is crap at telling us where exactly a particular signal is coming from, okay? So we're using EEG in concert with fMRI at the moment to try and discover where exactly the signals are occurring from. And then I think, kind of specifically to this talk, I think it's interesting to think of evidence accumulation, bias, speed pressure, and decision confidence in terms of everyday decisions that we're making. If we have an important decision to make, we should consider accumulating much more evidence, and we're going to care about being more confident about those decisions. We should also maybe try and recognise when we're going to be biased and when our bias might put us in the direction of a particular outcome. And indeed, if we have a decision that isn't of sincere consequence, maybe we don't need that much evidence, and maybe we don't need to be that confident. Maybe we just need to decide and move on, much like my pizza and burger example. And lastly, I'd just like to thank everybody on the slide here in the O'Connell lab, because they've elevated my understanding in perceptual decision making to be able to deliver this talk, and without their help I wouldn't be able to do it. And lastly, I invite you all to ask me any questions.
It was a great talk, Pat. Thanks for that. Does anyone have any questions you want to ask?
Yeah, yourself.
It was great, thanks a million.
Thank you.
I'm going back to your pizza and burger example.
Okay.
Because the evidence you were accumulating there was from memory rather than from perceptual stuff. So is there a memory-based CPP as well?
That is a good question, and honestly, I don't know. Off the top of my head, I don't know, but I suppose one thing to elaborate on is absolutely I was making that decision from memory, but I was also like kind of looking introspectively as well to consider how hungry I am at the moment. You know, my stomach has got some serious rumblies, so that's why I want a bigger meal as well. So there was a bit of perception there, but absolutely there was some memories also. Thanks very much, I apologize. Sorry, Steph. Yourself?
Yeah, when you're doing the fMRI, can you see how, I think quite a lot of people's decisions are emotionally driven, and they tend to, like, afterwards say, oh yeah, I thought that.
Absolutely.
But in fact, I didn't think at all.
Like a post hoc reasoning.
Precisely. And I'm just wondering, in your fMRI imaging, have you picked up the emotional centers lighting up? Can you map the overall activity in the brain per decision?
So I don't look at much of the data analysis for the fMRI experiment, but I'll give you my understanding with that caveat. Trials, to really get an insight into how the signals are arising, we kind of average trials, so looking at it at the single trial level would be much more difficult. In our specific research, they're very low level perceptual decisions, so we're trying to make them not evocative at all. So we're hoping that there'll be no, let's say, emotion salience networks activated because it's just some moving dots, or it's just maybe it's a grating that's, you know, pointing left or pointing right. So in our experiments, I don't think we would see that type of emotion lining up, but in research that would be adjacent to what Steph was doing, you would be able to see emotion centers lining up. I'm not sure, I'm honestly not 100% sure if you would see that on the single trial level, but that would be a question for maybe somebody else in the audience to answer better.
It's great talk.
Thank you very much. Yourself?
Thanks, Pat. I'm just wondering, have you thought about how to look at all of this outside of the lab and actually in the real world, maybe the potential of a dry EEG or something like that?
That's not something that we've thought about in the lab, and I think we want to control so much for our experiments, and because the tasks are so simple, I don't think it's something that the O'Connell lab will be particularly interested in. I do know the Whelan lab look at dry EEG for like clinical applications at home and stuff, but I think for the purposes of the type of perceptual research we're doing, we want the environment to be super controlled, which is why we wouldn't maybe post a kappa to somebody and ask them to do that at home or something like that. Yeah. Oh, yourself?
My question might be a bit more simple. I know absolutely nothing about this stuff, so apologies.
No, jeez.
So based on when you do your experiments, do you think it has an effect on people that they know they're being experimented on? Based on, because they know they're being watched making decisions? Would that affect?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Like, for instance, something that my colleague in the audience actually, Mr. Harvey McCone, soon to be doctor hopefully in a couple of years, and he looks at urgency. So I do think the notion of being observed does kind of add a bit of pressure. You know, I talked about speed pressure earlier, so the idea of observational pressure, you know, might add to people's urgency. But I guess one of the jobs of the likes of myself, who collects a lot of data, is to really try and put the participant at ease. So although I'm observing their signals being propagated in real time from their EEG cap, I'm not standing over them, you know, looking at them. I've actually closed the door into the booth and I'm sitting outside, and they have kind of full agency over themselves at that point. And I think, I participate in many experiments as well, and I don't really have a felt sense of somebody watching me. So I think it's put aside largely. But if someone was of an anxious disposition, yeah, absolutely, that could impact their EEG, definitely.
Do you want to ask?
Yeah, I have a question. The
Yeah.
sensors in the head, like how accurately they works in compared to guns?
So the EEG, the electrodes are incredibly sensitive. Like we're looking at like things on the millivolt level, and so we have very sensitive electrodes combined with a really powerful amplifier to really boost those signals. So as somebody who collects data, one thing I'm conscious of is after I plug in all the electrodes, I do some troubleshooting to make sure I'm getting a clean signal. So I go to great pains to make sure there's no other electrical equipment in the room that's interfering with it, because that would be very obvious to me. And I'll be asking my participant to make sure their feet are square on the floor, they're not crossing their feet, or they're not tapping their hand or anything, because those things do interfere. And an interesting thing that I can see in real time is inattention. So if somebody's getting bored or like kind of falling asleep, there's a pattern of EEG activity called alpha, like a very rhythmic wave. And I'm like, oh, this person's falling asleep. So I'll kind of knock, like, oh, you're doing great, you know, keep it up. And so it's very sensitive. Yeah, super accurate, very sensitive.
Thank you. Just to add up to the question, like, what's the time duration that you have given, like, in terms of like look at urgency? Like, what's the time minutes that you have given?
So for speed pressure, depending on the complexity of the task, but in an experiment I've collected data for, it's like 2 seconds. If you don't respond within 2 seconds, too slow.
Okay.
Perfect. Alright, can we stop any alpha waves right now?